Well, a very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for making the time this morning to join us for what I think will be a very special event here at Stimson. You know, it was 20 years ago that the UN cast a spotlight on the plight of children caught in armed conflict when the organization established a special representative for children in armed conflict. And really over the 30-year history of this organization, we have paid particular attention in various ways to this issue. My colleague Aditi Gore, who joins us here today, is doing some pioneering work on the issue of civilians caught in armed conflict around the world. South Sudan, in Mali, in CAR, and elsewhere. And I would really encourage you, if you do not know Aditi, to get to know her and get to know some of her work as well. You know, I think that the senseless act of armed violence that we saw in this country earlier this week reminds us that no one is immune from armed violence anywhere around the world. Unless we think that humanity cannot do worse, of course, we then look the other way as these weapons are awash in armed conflict zones around the world, and we pair them no less with children. And so my colleague Rachel Stoll, I think you will certainly be hearing more from in the panel discussion, has done her own pioneering work, I think, on the issue of child soldiers in the midst of armed conflict. So our interest, of course, in this issue of children in armed conflict, and the fact that it is truly a nonpartisan issue, we can all agree that this is a bad thing, wherever you sit on the political spectrum in this country, which is why I think this is a particularly opportune moment to initiate this discussion here in Washington at this particular time. And in that regard, I'm very pleased to be joined. You will all hear more from a very good friend of the Stimson Center, Kathleen Keenast, who is the Director of Gender Policy and Strategy Program at the U.S. Institute for Peace, as well as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Eric Gaudiosier. Very grateful to you for joining us as well. But I am particularly pleased to be welcoming Ms. Virginia Gamba, the United Nations SRSG for Children in Armed Conflict. See, that's a very long, you have an extra long business card, Virginia. Ms. Gamba was appointed to the position by the Secretary General earlier this year, and she serves as the fourth SRSG for children in armed conflict. I'm really grateful to you, Virginia, for your service on this particularly important issue, not just to Stimson, but to the international community. We're very grateful to you, and I would like to take the opportunity to just now get out of your way and invite you up to the dais and share some remarks. And once Virginia has had Ms. Gamba, has had a moment to, thank you, Virginia, has had a moment to share some thoughts with us. We're grateful to her that she will be joined she will join the panel discussion, and you will have an opportunity to interact with her. With that, I give you Ms. Virginia Gamba.
Thank you very much. I feel I'm coming home. You've received me like family, and I feel it's my family here. So thank you all for taking the time to come and listen to this topic. I'm new to it, but I've been around it for a long, long time. And I think that's true for almost everybody in the room, you know. Sometimes we work on some areas of violence or peace and conflict or conflict resolution or weapons control or any aspect of peace and security or peace and stability. And in the margins, running around, there's kids. So I'm very grateful to God primarily because I think I have this opportunity. For me, it's been like a kid in the candy store. Always having seen kids running around the margins of all the issues I've dealt with in 40 years of peace and security, to be given the opportunity to focus on them as the primary issue really is phenomenal. So I am into a journey of rediscovery with the hope to perhaps make a difference if we can. I talk too much, so basically Sharon made sure that I have something to read. So I will read. It goes against my grain, but I'll do it just to be short, and then we can engage more with the panelists afterwards. So I realize our mandate is not very well known to all in DC circles. In fact, it's not very well known to all in many different circles, not just DC. So I want to give you just a very brief overview of why our unique mandate, the one that I carry this long title of, exists, what we have accomplished for children so far, and how it fits into the larger peace and security agenda. People often consider that children are at the periphery of violence during conflict. I think that's an old-time thinking. In reality, children are at the center of violence and are currently being recruited and used, killed, maimed, abducted, and raped in the thousands. Their schools and their hospitals that they attend are also being attacked, and they're being denied basic humanitarian assistance by parties to conflict. And I may add, in many cases, the child is moving from being abused by everybody to being a tactic or used as a tool of war in herself or himself. Not only have child's rights been violated, they have also been forced or induced or convinced to commit violations themselves. The world decided to redouble its efforts to redress this just over 20 years ago, when Graça Machel in Mozambique, then in South Africa, presented a groundbreaking report to the General Assembly, proving that children were the most profoundly affected by conflict. And the international community was really not doing enough, but they heard her. So a few weeks later, the mandate that I now hold was born, and it said, or the decision was, to create this post of a high-level UN official that would be in charge of ensuring that the spotlight stayed firmly shining on this issue and keeping it high on the international agenda. This role is rather unique in the United Nations system, as those familiar with the UN can attest, but it demonstrated the seriousness with which the global community was willing to act. I tell Sharon that when I got to my office in May, June, for me it was walking into a magic room, and there was a magic carpet, and it was on the floor, because it's the ideal mandate. There is political willingness. Everybody can agree that the protection of children is paramount. But there's a type of complacency that has set in the last 20 years. That happens in all politics, right? I mean, once you get through the agony of getting a policy agreed and a convention signed and ratified, you forget about it. Put it aside, it's been done, been there, done that, let's do the next thing. And so you have this carpet there, but it's got a table on top and it's full of dust. So for me, the option is not to recreate an old issue, but if you want to shake the carpet so it can fly again. And not that my predecessors have not attempted their best, but I do think that we have now to bring back this issue in full force and not relaunch it, but present it again to the world, for the world to understand what is happening. So, since the creation of my office, the mandate has brought the voice of children to the world's highest fora. It has sensitized the international community to the devastating consequences of war on children and catalyzed commitments and actions to address grave violations against them. While the mandate originally sits with the General Assembly, what is so odd about my room to maneuver is that it has been repeatedly reinforced by Security Council resolutions over the last 18 years. So I've got Security Council resolutions behind me, I've got General Assembly behind me, and this has provided us a really strong set of tools. Every 2 years or so, the Security Council identifies a new criteria to identify grave violations. So these keep adding up. Today I have 6. I started with 1. So I don't know in 10 years' time how many more violations will be found, frankly, because the imagination of those that want to torture children has no limit. So other ways to bring aberration to the forefront on kids will happen. So we have a strong set of tools. This has led to some concerted action by the United Nations, in some cases by regional organizations, some member states, civil society has been mobilized. But this is the only mandate that reports. I'm the only office, in fact, I'm the smallest secretariat office, with the smallest staff, with the highest reporting burden of the whole of the secretariat, because I report 3 times yearly, which is huge. I report to Security Council, I report to General Assembly, and I report to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Perhaps when this started, we had what we call situations, perhaps 5 identified conflict situations worldwide where children were being used and abused, recruited, used, or maimed and killed. And it's sad for me to say that today we have 20. So with the small group of people I have, and having been forced by the mandate to report yearly, I can't choose not to do it. I also have to cover 20 situations, of which 15 are in the agenda of the Security Council. That means that I also report to the working group of the Security Council and work with them on, aside from the 3 annual reports, I also have to do country reports every 3 or 4 years to see how the situation in these countries is evolving in respect to children. So the 20 situations I cover, they really span the globe. I have in every continent except perhaps Europe at this point in time. It goes from Afghanistan to DR Congo, Mali, Myanmar, Nigeria, Colombia, South Sudan. But if you can think of a hot spot in the world, I'm there. There will be children being used and abused in that hot spot, and I can guarantee that as we speak. My office is responsible for systematically monitoring and reporting on these 6 grave violations as the mandate of the Security Council asked me to, against children in armed conflict. And the 6 ones that I monitor, every 3 months or so, we get the report from the field, and with that information, at the end of the year, we build up the reports. But the 6 are recruitment and use of children, the oldest one, and perhaps the clearer one. Killing and maiming of children, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, abductions, attacks on schools and hospitals, and any incident of denial of humanitarian access to children as a result of war. With the assistance of UN colleagues on the ground, and these are interagency colleagues, it's a UN monitoring process, not a civil society one, we collect and analyze this information and turn it into several products, including the annual report of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict with its list of state and non-state perpetrators. In fact, I think we are one of the oldest mandates that includes a list of attribution of those that are violating the rights of the children. And it's very interesting. I often say that if this mandate was being negotiated today in the political environment that we sit in today, I don't think we would have a chance of getting unanimity in the Security Council for the creation of an attribution list attached to this report. So at least I'm personally very committed for that to keep going, because if it was not there, I don't think it would be recreated. So I think, we have to protect this part of the mandate very, very much. We also engage in dialogue with non-state armed groups. Again, the very first one of the Secretariat is a mandate that included non-state armed groups is mine. So not only an attribution list, but also a direct request for us to engage directly with non-state armed groups. We also engage with states themselves, and this is unique to the UN system. This leads to the negotiation with both armed groups and state actors of what we call action plans with those parties that are listed. Unlike what one would have thought today, that an attribution list was to generate sanctions or eventually lead to some type of tribunal. At the time when it was created, it was not for that end. It was for memory, yes, for the future, absolutely. It's there. It exists and can be utilized in the future as necessary as countries progress and end their conflicts. But more importantly, if you're listed in the Security Council report we produce, then our first obligation is go to you as a listed party, whether you're an NGO, an armed group, a non-state actor group, or a governmental group, that we go and we say, listen, you know, we have proof that you're doing this, you've been named, let's work together so that you stop this. So it's very proactive. That the essence of it is to stop the violation from happening. There is attribution, there is accountability, but in essence, you start action plans to deal with those that have already committed violations, to try to stop that violation from occurring. And it's an interesting exercise to try to do this at the time of armed conflict. We've got a number of these. I mean, I'll tell you about them now. About 27 we have, of which the majority are with, or about 8 of them are with governments, and the rest is with non-state actors. We also negotiate the release of children. We help governments establish frameworks for accountability, and we advocate for the inclusion of child protection concerns under peace processes that are being negotiated. To date, we have played a part in the release of over 120,000 kids and negotiated over 27 action plans with governments and armed groups. The advocacy is working. For example, in the DRC, Congo, a country previously known for its army of Kadogo, or child soldiers, the government has taken robust actions in the last 2 years and has put in place concrete measures to have a child-free army. A general recently told the United Nations colleague, we have changed how we look at children. We don't recruit them anymore. It's in our blood. The change is irreversible. And I'm glad to say that there are some non-state actors that have signed action plans with us that have achieved the same success of stopping the recruitment of children. So clearly, somehow, sometimes it works. Recruitment and use of children is probably the most well-known violation we cover. Here in DC, it gained prominence in policy circles when Congress adopted the Child Soldiers Prevention Act in 2008, which keeps it in the spotlight on an annual basis. And I think when Rachel talks, she can expand a little bit more on that. But I can attest that this act has had a significant effect on the countries with whom we work. This first and most emblematic violation of the mandate is not limited to the recruiting or abducting of children for the purpose of holding a gun and waging battle. In most cases, recruitment and use is the pillar around which other violations coexist. The image of the child holding the gun is one, and this one we have in our heads. I think it's atavic when we think of child soldiers, but many children are equally victimized when they are used for other support or criminal purposes by these armed groups or forces. They serve as porters, cooks, prostitutes, lookouts, can be sent on reconnaissance, can be information gatherers, they can be asked to stand guard. The most tragic of those, we think, and I've noticed that in the last 2 years, particularly, is a rise in this type of use, is kids use as human shields or human bombs. And I think this year alone in Nigeria, over 50 girls have been forced to march with their babies because they were raped, and they were not yet 16, and they were marched into markets with vests and blown up together with the market. And it's been 50 just this year, in just one situation. And it's just on the rise. So we're seeing this constantly. We're also seeing this in Iraq, we're seeing it in Afghanistan. So for us, this is one of the most tragic uses of children. It's one of the most heinous acts that we see, and it is on the rise. This is not only time away from their family and out of school, but kids also fall victim to other horrific violations associated with recruitment and use, including sexual violence, again on the rise. These two violations are on the rise. Abduction, sexual violence, this use of kids as human bombs. These children can be used as sex slaves, they can be forced to marry the combatants or randomly abused, and sometimes for revenge purposes. Particularly if you are the family of one of the groups and it's a family member of one of the groups that are waging war. It is important to note that this affects both girls and boys, and more in the Middle East countries, it's more boys that are being raped than girls, but it happens. The crucial work that has been done to end the use of child soldiers has helped to lay the foundation to address other grave violations. Sustained advocacy and engagement by the United Nations and its partners have resulted in concrete efforts to end impunity for sexual violence against children. This is an area we have really advanced, to get commanders and to get those responsible to be tried in their own courts and to have criminalization of these types of acts in national legislation. And we are advancing there. Actions to reduce child casualties, commitments to protect schools from military use. We have advanced a little bit in making people understand they cannot use a school for military purposes, one side or the other. And the recognition of the urgent need for education in emergencies is being slowly seeping in. I also want to touch on an issue that frequently comes up in discussions with colleagues here in DC, that of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers. I was, as we all were, horrified. At the time, I think I was, must have been deputy in disarmament in the UN, and I was horrified by the accounts in the Central African Republic about rampant abuse of minors and others by UN peacekeepers. That incident focused world attention on this problem and has catalyzed concerted action within the UN system and its reform processes. My office has played a significant part in examining the current system aimed at instituting creative changes to eradicate this scourge, and about a month ago the Secretary General appointed an advocate specifically to look at this issue. You may have seen the Secretary General's recent report on the issue or watched the high-level event he recently held in New York 2 weeks ago. He has continued to fight against sexual exploitation and abuse, started by his predecessor, and it is one of his highest priorities. I can confirm that there has been a significant change in the way the UN deals with this issue and with troop-contributing countries, by the way, both in its internal systems and in its partnership with member states. While my mandate only covers a small piece of the sexual exploitation and abuse issue, it's really covered by 3 different units within the UN system. We remain strongly supportive of these initiatives and vigilant to ensure it makes it into our reporting. When we see it, we do report it. And I tell you, sometimes there's a lot of pressure for us to, not say exactly what's happening, but we do. A big issue facing this country, as many countries around the world, is that of migration flows. While my mandate is limited to children fleeing or displaced by conflict, it is a global problem that is growing daily, and one which challenges the United Nations to help as many as possible with fewer and fewer resources. I understand that my colleague Volker Turk from UNHCR, Refugee Agency, was here last week for a high-level dialogue on forced displacement from Central America. We work very closely with the refugees and have incredible respect for the work they do. While the unaccompanied minors coming into the US from Central and South America are not technically fleeing armed conflict, rather armed criminal gangs or other violent contexts, the vulnerability and needs of a child escaping violence in Syria and one running from gangs in Honduras are very similar, and abuses against them all too common. The one situation my mandate does cover in the Americas is that of Colombia. It has been a unique but rewarding challenge to contribute to the peace agreement discussions regarding children in that country. We were asked by the parties to assist them in finding a solution for the many children in the ranks of the FARC. We were able to meet and discuss with both sides the importance of protecting the future of this population. While challenges continue to meet these goals, such as children being released through the back door to evade serving as witnesses against their colleagues or to avoid repercussions, I remain hopeful that mechanisms are being put in place to assist those children in the long term. It's fundamental that I always say when peace hits the ground, children are the last priority. It's finished, it's peace, let's all be happy. But these kids will need rehabilitation. They will need psychosocial support. They will need skills development. They will need, some of them cannot even read and write because they were never sent to school. They will need support. And the only way you can provide that support is if you demobilize them openly. But if you just in the middle of the night tell the kids, just go away, you're free, they're not registered anywhere. We can't help them. They fall through the cracks. And where do they go to? They end up in organized criminal gangs because that's all they can do. So it's very important that in peace agreements it is understood by all sides that there must be a demobilization component that is clear from the start, from the get-go in that process. In this sense, I think my office was very proud because in Colombia particularly, my predecessor was called down to Cuba at the moment when a relative impasse had been reached in the negotiations for peace between the government and the FARC. And one issue that both sides agree upon was taking care of the children that were in the FARC-EP. We were able to help them find common ground and move forward to establish some protection for these children, which helped build confidence in other outstanding issues on the table. And history is showing us that the inclusion of child issues early in the negotiation processes, I have given that recommendation to the city that these processes are ongoing, must be put in early, ensures a much better outcome for them in the final document and makes a contribution to a sustainable peace in the long term. It also becomes a confidence-building measure to build trust between the parties because they all want to discuss what will happen with the kids. So it can be one of these issues that has got a lot of benefits. So to finish, a last note on a topic frequently in the news is that of violent extremism. I am really worried about this. I'm seeing a huge spiral. In most of the situations I cover, you see a plateau between the kids being recruited and the kids being released, and the numbers stay more or less the same, but they do not grow. But in those cases where we have violent extremists, they are not only doubling, they're tripling, they're quadrupling by year. So it seems to me that these groups really feed on kids. And I'm very worried about that because in no other situations are we seeing this increase as in those where violent extremists are involved. You will have heard some of the toughest conflicts listed among those that my mandate covers, and ones that will pose significant and difficult challenges for us all once they are over. Within the next 5 years, we will have tens of thousands of children, I think more than that will need specialized reintegration programs to allow them to rejoin their society and contribute to peace. However, a challenge that faces us right now is that of treatment of children that are members of, are accused of being associated with, family members of an extremist group and their deprivation of liberty. The rise of extremist groups such as ISIL have tested the response capacity of national authorities and the international community alike. While recognizing the challenges that states face in addressing the threats posed by such groups, we must work to ensure that responses comply with international law. That's what differentiates us from groups in the first place. Right? If they do not, we risk aiding the very groups governments seek to combat. We continue to call for children allegedly associated with armed groups to be primarily treated as victims. I know it's hard, but we have to, regardless of their perceived threat, and for member states to adopt protocols for the handover of children encountered in military and security operations to child protection actors. Holistic approaches that take into account legitimate grievances, political alienation, and protection of human rights of the population are the only way to substantially address the challenge. Responses that perpetuate grievances will not aid development. Responses that comply with the rule of law will. I will conclude by touching upon a couple of upcoming issues that I would like you to look out for. The first is the new focus in the UN with this new Secretary General. He has come into the fray with one topic. This topic is prevention and conflict prevention. And I really appreciate his efforts to bring back to the center of the UN system. You will see in the new annual reports there are different formats. There is an enhanced language on the issue of prevention and their actions to match. So watch that space. I also plan to set up a lessons learned best practice unit, which will look back over the last 20 years of information we have collected and will analyze what we have done right and what we have done wrong to help us in the next 20 years. We've never had the capacity, the resources, the personnel to minimally reflect on what we are reporting. It's time for that to stop because we need to be efficient in what we push for when we try to get an action plan going. On this, I hope I can count upon your support, as many of you will have valuable knowledge to contribute to this. Lastly, I plan to build on the success of our Children Not Soldiers campaign. That little campaign, 2-year campaign, based on only one violation, recruitment and use, and only rolled out over 6 situations, was incredibly useful. We've noticed that where that campaign was rolled out, the armed
We've had our mics off, so hopefully you can hear us. Okay, good. I want to welcome you all again to the Stimson Center for, I think, what's clearly a very prescient and important conversation today. My name is Rachel Stoll. I am a senior associate here at Stimson, and I direct what's called the Conventional Defense Program. And our program examines a broad range of issues related to the international trade in conventional arms, including how these arms impact children in armed conflict. And as we've heard this morning, there are numerous ongoing crises that continue to threaten the lives and livelihoods of children around the world. There is no continent really immune, maybe Antarctica, from this scourge. We've seen children killed and injured in conflict, which I think is the most obvious sort of visualization, but we've also heard about the other ways in which children have been impacted, either as targets of sexual violence or abused and recruited as child soldiers. We've seen numerous attacks on schools, on hospitals, obstructions of provision of humanitarian assistance. The 6 violations that were mentioned, I think, really are the tip of the iceberg in the ways that conflicts continue to impact children around the world. Now, we at Stimson have focused on a variety of these impacts. Brian mentioned a DT's program and looking at the impact of children in conflicts, particularly in Africa, but in other places as well. My program has really looked at the recruitment and use of child soldiers and how the provision of military assistance contributes to that. And I promise I will get to that. But we're going to open the aperture a little wider than we at Stimson normally do to take advantage of our special guest this morning and discuss other devastating impacts of armed conflict on children. And I'm really delighted that we were able to gather such an expert panel to address these issues. Brian mentioned at the outset our special panelist this morning. We have Eric Gaudiosi, the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the State Department, and Kathleen Keenast, who's the Director of Gender Policy and Strategy at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So I want to give them each an opportunity to sort of narrow down a little bit on some of the topics that were discussed. I will then talk a little bit about the issue of child soldiers, and then we will open for everybody time for some questions that can be addressed to the entire panel. So I'm going to turn to Eric first and welcome you, and thank you for coming to Stimson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you as well for being here. I am Eric Gaudiosi from the Department of State, entirely, incidentally, on the far right of the panel.
In this nonpartisan issue.
Yes, I am overjoyed to be here. Henry Stimson is both a legend and a hero, and a reminder and an inspiration of a time when there were many issues that were bipartisan. We look both backward and forward on that. This is indeed an issue that is bipartisan. Similarly, speaking of inspirations, I want to thank our keynote speaker for her actions, for her activism, for her vision, literally around the world on this issue. Some years ago, my own child asked me what I knew about this issue. I don't know if he was impressed, but I was, as I reflected upon my own career, be that service in Egypt, working on the issue of the exploitation of migrants, be that in the former Yugoslavia, where children were often victimized in conflict, in Libya, in the same circumstance. So for my generation of Foreign Service officers, this has been an issue that has been not at the periphery, but increasingly central. And it has been a generation since the creation of the position of the SRSG. That is a generation that has grown to adulthood without knowing a childhood as we might define it or wish it. My son asked this question because he wanted to do a book report on the perhaps classic of this genre, Long Way Gone. This was very controversial at his school, and their solution was that he be given the opportunity to present his book report only to the teachers, not to his fellow students. He was very proud of himself for giving what he called a classified book report. And afterwards, I asked him why he had chosen this, and he said, I did not want to talk about Little House on the Prairie. I wanted to talk about kids who don't have little houses at all. So with that spirit, we confront this issue. And it is one that will require the concerted effort of our government and the interagency within our government, but indeed the entire international community. So when we applaud the Secretary General's very bold reform agenda, this is both a vital part of it and underscores the necessity of success. When we talk about the need to improve activism in the field, when we talk about the need to improve coordination between and among United Nations agencies, this is part and parcel of addressing this issue in partnership with regional and sub-regional organizations, with civil society, with non-governmental organizations. That is the challenge. And that is one that we have tried to clearly endorse, including most recently at the UN General Assembly in New York, to make clear that we support the Secretary General's efforts to ensure not only that the United Nations remains true to its ideals, but it remains a driving force in the field. The field includes, sadly, too many examples, but when we look to just two, for example, when we look to Syria, we see the centrality of this issue in a conflict where one casualty in 3 is below the age of 15, where hospitals, schools have been not only incidental or collateral damage, but explicitly targeted by all sides. That is why the emphasis for us diplomatically has been on full enforcement of repeated resolutions. And this is, as you so duly noted, an issue where resolutions have been passed and we are intent on seeing them enforced. Similarly, in the Lake Chad Basin, of course, the 2014 kidnapping case highlighted attention on this issue, but it was hardly an exception. To the extent that that focuses international attention, that we can use that to drive consensus and activism, that is certainly our goal. And I understand you were very recently in Nigeria for the ceremony there. This, again, highlights the important roles that are played by UNICEF, for example, but the missions in the field. A great deal of my time is working on peacekeeping issues, where the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse is yet another recurring issue, and one where we have been at the extreme, and I think appropriately, on ensuring that conduct and discipline reflects a zero-tolerance approach towards that, and we appreciate and applaud your efforts in this regard as well. I want to reserve time for questions as well, but I do think, as I said, from the perspective of the department and for our embassies in the field, we have sadly developed a great deal of expertise on this issue. We have not yet solved it. My intention is to make sure that that is the goal, and that is not for a lack of effort, not for a lack of innovation, not for a lack of imagination, and certainly not for a lack of cooperation with partners near and far across the spectrum in order to solve this problem so that another generation does not pass.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Kathleen, cognizant of the time, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end of the panel.
Great. Well, I want to also echo my appreciation to all of you, and also for your inspiring remarks. And thank you, Sharon, as well. I'll add that. This public awareness really strikes me as a crucial ingredient we need right now. And I was thinking about this the other day in preparing my remarks this morning. My first confrontation with child abuse was through Charles Dickens' novels when I was a young person. You know, the orphaned Oliver Twist, the crippled Tiny Tim, the doomed Tyke, Little Nell. But Dickens focused the world's attention during the Victorian era in England on the horrific conditions of children who were born into poverty and stuck there forever. Well, Dickens was no policymaker, not even a journalist, but he was a brilliant social critic. And similarly, I feel like we're looking for that 21st century Dickens who can bring these stories of children who are being exploited by violent extremists and other armed non-state actors to a narrative that can move us to action. Though I'm an anthropologist, I certainly share the passion and outrage of Charles Dickens about the condition and treatment of children, and especially now those subjected to violent extremist groups who take great liberty with these children's vulnerability. But even without Charles Dickens here, their stories are compelling. We know that children have been used over the last 4 years in ISIS for suicide missions, to execute prisoners and to act as spies in families and neighborhoods, markets and schools. ISIS refers to them as tiny terrorists. The boys as young as 6 are recruited to the cubs of lions of the caliphate. The boys are lured in with bribes of money, food, and weapons, and then they're shipped off to tiny tot camps where they first learn to behead dolls and then to execute human hostages. Whether in Syria, Iraq, Nigeria, girls are used strategically by extremists to incentivize recruitment with the promises of virgin wives and sex slaves. The tactic of using sexual violence as a form of currency is widespread for compensating fighters. This includes kidnapping them, enslaving them, and reselling them. In her recent book, Rape During Civil War, Dara K. Cohen, a former USIP peace scholar and now at Harvard, argues that armed groups that recruit their fighters through random abduction of strangers, and often use children in this regard, use gang rape to create bonds of loyalty and trust between soldiers. This kind of research is necessary for us to understand how these systems work. These are criminal systems. These are very entrepreneurial systems, and we are naive to not take a very scientific approach to how these things are being accomplished. As we've heard before, sexual violence is cheaper than a bullet and far more effective. And certainly terrorist groups have figured that out and are using it in a very productive manner. In South Sudan, rape is used for ethnic cleansing, tactic of war, and the stories abound and remind us that violence against children happens directly as well as through secondary trauma. One refugee fleeing South Sudan described how soldiers had ordered her and other women out of their vehicle and told at gunpoint to remove their clothes and lie down. The children then watched their mothers systematically raped. We forget the impact of this kind of trauma and violence. While extremist groups commit atrocities, it is important, as we talk about this issue, that most sexual violence against children during wartime, when social norms fall apart, is actually perpetrated by family members, neighbors, and acquaintances, not combatants. The DRC continues to experience this rampant form of sexual violence against children, sometimes used in this idea that somehow sex with a child will prevent HIV. These are the kind of myths we have to dispel. This form of violence gets very little attention by the UN, by NGOs, or even the media, and nor is it counted in our reporting system in many of these organizations. So why is this all important? UN rep from Djibouti said so aptly, children in danger are indeed dangerous children. Their lives are often broken forever. So our policies can't not take this threat seriously. If ISIS is paying families for boys to pick up a gun and buying their girls for sex slavery or child brides, what kinds of financial incentives can be offered to counter these issues? Why can't children instead pick up a pencil and have a chance to learn? Why don't we put our finances into this form of prevention early on? We need to look at the way to engage kids with critical analysis, skill sets that help lead them away from extremists, not toward them. And one of my biggest areas that I'd like to see, if we can launch Women, Peace, and Security 17 years ago, we need to launch Children, Peace, and Security. We need to get the intersection between children, prevention, and security. As Virginia said so well, it's not just being victims now. They are also being part of the production of violence, with or without their own wills. So, policymakers should consider how security can be enhanced, even modest efforts to combat the ability of extremists to recruit children and to perpetrate sexual violence to both boys and girls. And I really appreciate your point about the differences in regions. We have to develop age-sensitive exit ramps for children and youth who have just been entangled in the web of violent extremists. Control and brainwashing and abuse. We have to recognize in refugee camps the need for these young minds to need food as well as food for their bodies. And we have to encourage greater government and private investment to educate these kids in refugee camps as a step out of the camp. We need to inspire Melinda Gates to think about this as a form of immunization of the future. And we need to develop the very, very best trauma counseling and healing assistance for all victims of sexual violence. This kind of violence is stitched into the children's DNA, and it's reproduced into another generation. We have a lot of work ahead of us. We know that we have more children living on this planet who are approaching their adolescent rite of passage. I'm an anthropologist after all. And they're looking for ways into adulthood. And my theory is part of the extremist movement is giving them that kind of link. Oh, I can become an adult through this violence. We know that that is the quickest way to end a childhood. Violence is the shortest path to end a vision. We need much more vision and a lot more gumption and a lot more funding to make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you for those inspired remarks, Kathleen. And I think it lends itself to the reality that this is not an issue that affects children for a short period of time when they're children. These are issues that have a devastating legacy on the individual child, on the society as a whole, their families, their communities, and the larger country. And so this is not something that you say, well, you're 18 now, the trauma is over, you're an adult, and you move on. These are issues that are really life-changing and societal changing. And I think turning back quickly to the issue of child soldiers, because I think that's something that's familiar to many of you. I think that's something you can visualize, you can see. It's an issue that has plagued hundreds of thousands of children in the past, tens of thousands of children continuing today in government forces, in non-state groups, in now with these violent extremist groups. And they're in countries in conflict around the world. This is not an African problem or a South American problem. This is really, truly a global problem. And as Virginia mentioned, you see child soldiers in conflicts around the world being used as frontline combatants, but also in a variety of support roles. And so I'm dating myself a little bit here, but for about 20 years, I've thought, what can we do? What incentives can we use to try to get governments in particular to change their behaviors? What leverage do we have or regarding governments to help them stop recruiting and using child soldiers in their own forces? And so probably about 18 years ago, we started looking at this issue of provision of military assistance, and particularly arms sales, to governments that are using child soldiers, and thought, could we use that as leverage? Could we incentivize the provision of that assistance, which is so heavily demanded, and say, if you want this, then you have to stop this behavior? And there are a range of mechanisms that exist that prohibit the exploitation of children in armed conflict, but there really are very few mechanisms that look at this particular aspect. And I think there's a very clear link between the provision of weapons and the use of child soldiers. There's horrific stories about children being lined up and given an AK-47, and if they can carry it, they're taken away. If they can't, they wait till the group comes through the next time to see if they're strong enough. I think that link is established. But there's very little being done to look at that provision of military assistance to governments that are using child soldiers. There are only 3 governments in the world that even have legislation on the books preventing the provision of weapons and military assistance to governments using child soldiers: Belgium, Switzerland, and the United States. And the United States really is a pioneer, as Virginia mentioned, on this topic. There is an act, the Child Soldiers Prevention Act of 2008, known as the CSPA, that encourages foreign governments to stop recruiting and using child soldiers by leveraging much sought-after U.S. arms and military assistance. So what this law does is it specifically requires the Secretary of State to identify countries that in their government forces or in their government-supported armed groups recruit and use child soldiers. And then a second step is that it prohibits these countries from receiving 7 categories of military assistance that fall under both the provision by the State Department as well as the Department of Defense. And those categories are direct commercial sales, so those are sales that happen between companies and the governments. Excess defense articles, those are items that we give away, the U.S. military gives away at a reduced or low cost. Foreign military financing, which is money that they use to purchase U.S. weapons. Foreign military sales, which are the actual weapons transferred themselves. International military education and training assistance, which is when we bring foreign nationals to U.S. training centers to receive military training. Peacekeeping operations assistance, which is separate from sort of peacekeeping operations themselves. And Section 1206 assistance, which was a counterterrorism fund that was created after 9/11. In 2017, the State Department identified 8 countries that it claims recruit and use child soldiers in their militaries, in their national militaries, or in government-supported armed groups. And these are not going to be a surprise to you. We've heard their names many times. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. The president, however, can choose to waive the prohibitions that are outlined in the CSPA for a national security reason. And that would allow countries to receive in part or in full the military assistance that had been provided or had been offered to them. So the 2017 list was particularly controversial in the fact there were 3 countries I didn't mention that have been mentioned by others on this stage that were missing: Afghanistan, Iraq, and Myanmar, or Burma. These are 3 countries which have notorious and perpetual use of child soldiers, have previously, with the exception of Afghanistan, been on the U.S. list before, and they suddenly disappeared despite evidence to, particularly in Iraq and the entire Middle East region, an exponential growth in the use of children in conflict. By coincidence, this panel falls within the few days in which the president has made his waiver determination. And this year, the administration waived the CSPA prohibitions for 5 of the 8 countries. And the punchline is the 3 countries that didn't have waivers granted, Syria, Sudan, and Yemen, were of course not slated to receive any U.S. military assistance. This is not unique to this administration. This law has been on the books since and in effect since 2009. And during the Obama administration, just to give you a comparison, because I do want to be fair here, this is not unique to the Trump administration, but during the Obama administration, the U.S. Routinely waived the prohibitions on the CSPA and authorized more than $315 million in arms sales, more than $1.2 billion in military assistance to countries with known human rights abuses against children in armed conflict. So if you look at what that looks like, that means they only withheld $8 million in arms sales and $56 million in military assistance. That's 2.6% of total arms sales and 5% of military assistance that would have been otherwise prohibited under the CSPA if those provisions hadn't been waived. Without getting too bogged down in numbers, the reason I wanted to highlight that is that we have a tool at our disposal, a strong tool, a tool that has in the past been seen as effective to change behavior of states, to get them to work with the SRSG's office and sign action plans that have been used diplomatically to encourage changes in behavior. We've had countries go off that CSPA list because of their desire to acquire U.S. military assistance. And yet, year after year, we see the squandering, the missing of an opportunity to really bring this issue to the fore and to encourage states to change their behavior. This is not just a problem the United States needs to solve unilaterally. I think as Eric mentioned, this is something that the international community can work together, that other governments can adapt and adopt laws similar to the United States, but we must and we can do better. And I think Kathleen had some very thoughtful suggestions as well, but I look forward to a discussion with all of you of what other steps can be taken to stop the continued victimization of children in conflict around the world. So with that, I will open it up to questions. You can address your question to anyone on this panel. I would just ask, there's a microphone that you speak into it. This event, I should have said at the beginning, is being live streamed. And so we want our listeners online to be able to hear, and also to identify yourselves when you're asking a question. So we'll come. Oh.
Thank you. Angela Stevens with USAID, work on Sudan and South Sudan. I'd love to hear about what Ms. Gamba's office is doing regarding South Sudan in particular, where the situation is going from grave to worse. Thank you.
Sorry, I was waiting to see others. Yes, I'm very worried about South Sudan. I have to say, it's one situation we're really not seeing any advancement, any progress. I have been a bit remiss. One of the first countries I wanted to go and visit when I took over was South Sudan, because I'm very concerned about it. But then I decided that perhaps it would be a better strategy to remain aloof and press for something to happen that would warrant my appearance. So I don't want to appear there in situations that are going down as a threat. I'd rather they got the press, because that's what happens when I travel, they get the press. I have to be very careful who I'm seeing shaking hands and etc. And I mean, the last thing I want to do is to be used myself, right? So I've decided to link it to good news and to push for good news at a distance. So in the case of South Sudan, I am waiting. I really am champing at the bit. I want to go there. I think the situation is very complex. I think we're seeing more and more abuse of children. It's one of these ones that is doubling. We are seeing no end to the strife. Humanitarian issues is horrific. The access issues are horrific. So what I've decided to do, and I'm going to try it out as a first-time experiment. Luckily I'm Latin American, so I have a lot of experience in the Latin American scenarios that could be applied. But I believe that the country affected by conflict, like I call the situation, the country is not an island. Rarely is it an island physically. It is surrounded by a group of countries. So I thought that we've never actually focused on a sub-regional approach to children in armed conflict containment, prevention, and control, and ending it. So I think with the case of South Sudan, I am going to approach it from an IGAD perspective. So I've already initiated this. I've gone and talked to the troikas and the presidencies of the sub-regional body. And my proposal to them is that we assist them to create perhaps an interest that I would like to have first a ministerial declaration from the immediate neighbors with a common definition on protocols, what is done, what is not. We're seeing more and more cross-border on children and armed conflict issues. It's hitting very much Mali, it's hitting Nigeria, it's hitting in South Sudan. And the problem when you have a peacekeeping operation is contained within the space of the mandate, but it becomes a gray area as you cross. So my idea is if we can get a ministerial declaration and perhaps eventually a head of state summit of that sub-region with a firm definition that they all consider some specific issues in relationship to the prevention of use of children in armed conflict, it might lead to perhaps a common protocol for release, a common protocol for detention across the border. But prepare a containment package that can stop the the oxygen from going into this situation. So in the case of South Sudan, I am very worried. The situation is getting worse. There's nothing I have seen in the last 2 years to minimally merit that there's any improvement in that situation. But I think the oxygen needs to be cut off. And I think the sub-region must be co-responsible. So I'm really going to work with the sub-regions to try to illuminate that process. I will be going very shortly to Africa. There's a meeting there of heads of state of the African Union, and I will make my case there. So I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I did have a few radio interviews to the population in South Sudan. I find it despicable, like I said it publicly, despicable that armed groups that fought for the independence of their country, to give their children freedom, the first thing they do with that independence is grab their own children and put them in a kind of civil war, using them as weapons. I think it's despicable, and they have to answer for that. So I think there are things that can be done. I think public awareness is very important, but I also think that the sub-region must be co-responsible for a solution, not just the United Nations or the African Union.
Thank you very much for your interventions. My name is Chantal Jonge-Oudhat from Women in International Security. Now, you all mentioned that the abuse of children is really on the rise everywhere. And I would like to ask you, why do you think that is so? What are the reasons for this increase in abuse? And then the second question is, how does this particular issue relate to other issues that the UN is dealing with? In particular, I'm thinking of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I'm also thinking of the Youth, Peace and Security agenda. And Kathleen has just added a possible new agenda, that's the Children, Peace and Security agenda. So how does this all tie together?
You can just move down.
Okay. English or Arabic?
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to agree twice with the last one thing you said with respect to South Sudan, where we see many of these problems occur in a situation that cannot even be generously described as static. And I do think it emphasizes the importance of a regional and sub-regional approach and cooperation with regional actors as well. All things we are talking about in the broad context of reform of the United Nations. Equally, I think by highlighting these various initiatives we see over the course of decades, statements made and initiatives rolled out, and now we are at a point, I think, where the question of prioritization and the question of synchronization in getting all these hands to be able to clap is really the challenge before us as member states and of the institution itself. And we feel the Secretary General has laid out a very, very ambitious agenda, an achievable one, and indeed, I think one that it is necessary to achieve. So that is the goal. The President has stated repeatedly that the United Nations is an organization of tremendous potential. Realizing that potential and realizing it as defined by having an organization that has not only action plans, but also actions in the field is really what we see as imperative. South Sudan is in many ways a case that underscores the complexity of the challenges, down to the question of, are statements and visits perceived as being benefits? Are they best reserved to try to leverage progress? We wrestle with these as an international community. But I do think, much as we have seen perhaps this phenomenon on the rise because it contributes to an environment where anything becomes possible, I think the obverse is also true. That if it is possible to to draw this as the line, to show that there is some consensus, then that generates the confidence to prove that it is possible and can, perhaps serves as a foundation for a political process, which is something that we do want to link very closely to our peacekeeping efforts in the field, that they must not exist in a vacuum, but rather contribute to an eventual political solution on the ground.
I think to answer your first question, Chantal, about why are we seeing an increase, I think particularly with the issue of child soldiers, you think about where child soldiers are being used. They're not being used in conflicts that are popping up. They're being used in conflicts that have been in existence for numerous years. And you think about just the war of attrition that is happening to these populations, where you have the majority of the population is under the age, not only just 30 anymore, the age of 18. And there's nobody left. There's nobody left to fight these wars. These wars would end, in some cases, if you didn't rely on these children to continue. And I'm not talking just about children, 10, 12, 15, but those who were children when it started, right? Who, as Virginia said, who have no education, they have no schooling, they've had no opportunities. The only life they know is being a soldier. Those conflicts are waging hotter and hotter and expanding and contracting in ways that have to do with what's left in the population. And so you're seeing, these massive abuses, whether it's terrorizing children, because there's no one left to recruit. There's no one left to use. And it's really a self-fulfilling cycle, because these kids aren't being given the opportunities. They're not being given effective demobilization and rehabilitation. And so the conflicts just continue to wage.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. I think that's very interesting. I was going to say, I think there is an increase in abuse with the rise of violent extremism. And I think there is also greater awareness. I mean, there's a classic situation. Is there more sexual violence in the world, or are we just now be able to name it as criminal, as a humanitarian issue? So some of it is, I think, awareness about the concern, and some of it is, in fact, greater influx of violent extremism. I wanted to come back and answer your question about other issues with the UN, and whether actually these targeted group, women, youth, children, whether these efforts make a difference. And because I work in women, peace, and security, I can certainly tell you all the shortcomings and the gaps. But I can also tell you that we're not going back. The understanding of this field, because of research, has made an enormous difference to inform the youth peace and security agenda, and I think would inform the children peace and security agenda. And I think, Virginia, you said it so well, children are at the center of all this. And I think once we begin to name it and claim it, we can begin to really start to build research that is peer-reviewed, that can start to see patterns. I think we've seen that around the issue of sexual violence and conflict, from this concept of 20 years ago, oh, well, it always happens in war, to actually fields of practice really trying to understand the patterns. So I'm in full support of more action plans, especially as they yield financial commitments and research.
I think what we'll do, just in the interest of time, if there are other questions, we'll take them as a group, and then we'll give the panelists one last chance to respond. So I think we have on this side of the room here, both here in front row or second row and last row. We'll start here.
Hi, Jeremy Young. I'm an investigative reporter with Al Jazeera. I find it kind of appalling that the U.S. would provide weapons sales and military aid to countries that we know violate this policy, and I know there's reasons for why that is done. But one of the things that we do in my field is we travel out, we document these types of abuses, and we raise this issue. And I'm just curious if you would direct us towards a particular conflict where our military aid and our weapon sales are actually worsening the conflict and making this problem graver? Is there one particular conflict that you think is particularly egregious, or where would you direct us to hone our investigative skills? Thanks.
I can pass it back, sorry, to the last row. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Sam. I'm part of a delegation from New Zealand, Young Leaders Delegation, to attend the World Bank IMF meetings next week. My question pertains to unfortunate reality, I suppose, that children within the context of armed conflicts is not a recent phenomenon. I mean, we look at the last century and the countries that are now on the policing side of the equation were very often offenders. Now, you know, they've gone through that development process. My question is, what are like the key societal or institutional changes a population needs to go through to clamp out this issue? Is it education, governance, or is it just a reduction of armed conflicts? Is there a key change?
And then one more here.
Thanks very much. Dan Owen, the World Bank. Catherine, lovely to see you. Thank you for the presentations and the comments. I think it is absolutely critical, this agenda. I manage a program at the World Bank providing, it's a facility supporting DDR programs in Africa. And I think one of the key lessons we've learned is that when it comes to reintegration, the whole challenge of reintegration children is an impossible one, and our success is very limited. Our program in DRC, all sorts of issues as far as the receptivity of host communities to absorb children who've been involved in conflict. So I think that all this points to prevention being the absolute, the real issue. And I'm wondering from the UN side, in our partnership, particularly with the peacekeeping DPKO, we're discussing a lot the community violence reduction (CVR) programs. Again, as I think a very promising approach for trying to tackle issues of preventive measures well upstream. I'd be interested to hear more about what you have in mind when you talk about specialized reintegration programs for children caught up in violent extremism. Thank you.
So I think we just have a few minutes, so I'm going to let Virginia start, and then we'll go to Eric and Kathleen for last comments, and then if there's time, I will make some, but I promise that I will respond to your question after, if not tonight.
Okay, let me try to be fast. First, I need to go to the World Bank and we can discuss this together. Because, in fact, I don't agree. I do believe that there is an answer for integration. And I think we just need to think about it in a different manner. One of the things that we're seeing, not just in the UN, but elsewhere, that people, the problems are too big. Like, you know, the vision is too big and people get scared of it. And then they take only a part of it. And there's a lot of compartmentalization, you know, like I will do up to demobilization, UNICEF will do the integration. Who does reskilling? Who knows? Who is responsible for the psychosocial part of it? Who knows? Who ensures that there is a degree of development occurring that it meets the SDG challenges in 15 years' time? It's not. Everyone is doing a part of it. And I think it's high time that we have that conference, that we actually have that discussion about what exactly is, where do you start from the prevention side all the way to the developmental side, passing through the whole rubric. So on the one side, I think we need to conceptually put a bit more effort, perhaps more brainstorming, perhaps small meetings, workshops. I think there's room there to start finding areas. Two, we have to think practically. I mean, I lived and you lived through the Ottawa process on the ban the landmine campaign. And one of the critical actions there, because it's a finite problem, it was seen as a finite problem. And if enough resources were pooled for people to use for demining purposes and also to take care of the needs of those who survived to be able to reintegrate them to society and give them limbs and help them with rehabilitation. There were pools created. I mean, I remember $500 million just for SADC member states to be able to access for paying these type of processes. Well, I would love to see a 500 million fund for reintegration purposes that could be accessed by those that need it through a specific issue. And where do you start and where do you finish? There's a lot to be said. But what I've noticed, I've gone to the European Union, and I've discussed it, it's fear. I notice fear. There are two things that I notice as fear. Here, in Europe, and elsewhere. It's about reintegration and what it costs and what it means and will it stick or not, and people don't want to talk about it. Integration. And the other one is migration. People are scared of discussing these two issues. I think it's time that we bring it to the table. So I think there are solutions that can be achieved, and I think there's some things that we can do, and I can give you a lot of examples of things that might be able to work. But let's start with a discussion. I think that's the main issue. I think on the other quick items, you know, we are one UN. I think we have to understand this. I mean, the initiatives that are occurring, there are lots of different initiatives, but you have to understand where they fit. I think one thing is under the Millennium hat, all the rethinking of the UN processes of the next 20 to 30 years until the strategic developmental goals that were inherited from the Millennium Goals, and all of that process that now has got 17 years and is ongoing. There were identification of critical groups of people that, if empowered, could make a difference. I think this is where the Women, Peace and Security agenda really fits. That's why the word peace is there. I don't know about children, peace and security. I would love to see in the next 2 years the United Nations Conference on Youth and Violence. That's what I would like to see. Because we have to understand what are the cycles of violence and how young people are reacting to violence. And it's not just in armed conflict situations. It goes much beyond that. And you're right. A lot of we're seeing is lowering of the age of the entire population. In Somalia, 70% of the population is under 24 years old. When I briefed the Security Council on the situation of massacres in the Kasai in June, we're talking of a new armed group that is made up 70% of children under 18 who are killing children under 12. Who is guilty of that? What is the dynamic of violence there? What does it tell us? It's displacing people to all the other countries in the region. There's about 700,000 displaced children in Angola alone because of that one small region. What is it telling us? So I think we need to unpack. We need to have a program of action that is understood by everybody, every region of the world, through the discussion in the UN system about youth and violence. What do we understand about it? How can it be contained? How can be? So I think there's a lot of dimensions over and above the armed conflict. I hear what you were saying about and it's true, I've heard the potential of the United Nations. I don't want to defend the United Nations in any way. But I think it's not so much a question of finding out what the potential is. It's to ask, how can I use the United Nations to the best effect for global peace? And I think the United Nations is not Mars. We're not Martians. We're not a member state of the United Nations. We are at the service of member states. So the member states must decide how to use the United Nations to its effect. We don't have a potential. All we have is how we are used. So I think as long as we see the UN as an alternative for action, it's fine. You can be an alternative for action, for global action, but you have to know where to put it and how to use it, and therefore you will know what resources to give it. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. I think on Al Jazeera you were talking about a good example. I think Iraq under Saddam Hussein is a good example of weapons sold to that dictator and what it led to, and sold by everybody under very specific situations. I think it's very interesting to look at that case. It's in the past, but it's interesting. I think on New Zealand, you were saying about the most recent phenomenon, I think I answered you. It's not education or governance. It's not, you see, the children in armed conflict and the child soldiers are not an issue that sits as isolated. It's part of a bigger issue. It's a much bigger issue. And if you go to that, I'm Latin American. The amount of kids I've seen, teenagers, being attracted to violence, to gang warfare, to enter in transnational criminal organizations, to engage in drug dealing. In this country, we have seen the terrible toll of drug addiction on kids in schools, in primary schools, secondary schools. We've invested millions to try to get them out of it. We still haven't managed to control drugs in that age group. So it's not just an armed conflict. It's violence and the way it is being expressed among the youth. And I have seen in a lot of countries, a lot of parents and society and the media pushing children that are between 12 and 13 to act like adults. It's expected of them to dress a little, to put the makeup, to go to the bloody party, to be at the 4 o'clock in the morning out with their friends because you're being free, you're being independent. You let them go around with the internet and with Facebook in whichever way you want. Okay, freedom of expression. But we are expecting of children in every region of the world to act as an adult at an earlier and earlier age. And this is being synthesized. So what are we talking about? I would love to see the conference. Perhaps out of a conference of youth and violence, we might end up with an action plan for youth and peace, or for children and peace. But that's just me, it's not the UN, I'm just saying that.
So there is actually another event in this room in just a few minutes. So but I don't want to cut off our other panelists, but I do want to give you a final opportunity if there's something before I say thank you to all of you. But
let me try to weave some of these threads together. I absolutely agree. This is a time of heightened and legitimately so international concern over the question of reintegration, over the question of migration. And I think the international community is seized of that, hopefully sufficiently seized in order to have this spirit of bold, persistent experimentation towards solutions. Hopefully that will focus the minds. As does investigative reporting. And I say this as the son of a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, not just as a diplomat. So I remain convinced that the best informed policy debate results in the best policy, and that information comes from all states. I do think as well that the challenge for the international community is to move as quickly as possible from the question of diagnosis to prescription, and towards that building an empirical basis in order to have a strong foundation. We need to move as quickly as possible to solutions in the field. Then we will be able to answer your questions. What is it? We are at a circumstance now where many of the countries we have cited as examples are also host to the largest and most expensive peacekeeping missions. These circumstances persist, not because of them, but in spite of their presence. We need to be prepared to do things differently. We need to be prepared to prevent rather than just be prepared. We need to be prepared to coordinate political solutions, social services, as well as merely keeping a peace. We need to be building on it.
No, I won't. I know you.
Well, I thank you for your indulgence in allowing us to go a few minutes late, and thank you, Virginia, for the work that you are doing, not only on this issue, but for the many years that I have known you, and your commitment to not only tackling some of these really difficult challenges, but from trying to prevent them in the first place. So thank you to all of you for your interest, to our panelists for spending a short time with us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.